December 25th, 1776. 9 o'clock at night, on the Pennsylvania bank of the Delaware River. The ice is running thick and jagged, chunks the size of dinner tables grinding against each other in the current, and a sleet is falling sideways hard enough to sting exposed skin. 2,400 men are standing in the dark waiting to board flat-bottomed Durham boats, muskets wrapped in cloth against the wet, most of them wearing rags where boots used to be. Their commander is 44 years old, sits 6'2" in the saddle, and has not won a real battle in over a year. Behind him, the war for American independence is dying quietly, of exhaustion, in the cold. He is about to bet the entire revolution on getting 3,000 men across a half-frozen river without anyone drowning, freezing, or being seen. So how does a general with a losing army, an expiring enlistment deadline, and a Congress already packing to flee Philadelphia turn one desperate gamble into 10 days that don't just save the war? They humiliate the greatest military power on earth? By the winter of 1776, the American Revolution was, by any sober military accounting, close to finished. Washington had been driven off Long Island, out of New York City, across New Jersey, and finally over the Delaware into Pennsylvania. A retreat of some 90 miles in under a month, conducted in front of a pursuing British and Hessian force that outnumbered him and outfought him at nearly every turn. His army, which had numbered close to 20,000 in the summer, had shrunk to under 5,000 effective men by December, and most of those were due to walk home, legally, on December 31st, when their enlistments expired. Thomas Paine, marching with the retreating army, had written the line that would become the era's epitaph. These are the times that try men's souls. Loyalists were coming out of the woodwork across New Jersey to swear allegiance to the crown. The Continental Congress had already evacuated to Baltimore, expecting Philadelphia to fall. If Washington did nothing, the Continental Army simply ceased to exist as a fighting force within a week, not from a British bullet, but from an expired contract. George Washington was not, by 1776, an obviously brilliant soldier. He was a Virginia planter's son who had come up hard by the standards of his class. His father died when George was 11, cutting off any hope of the English education his older half-brothers received, and he spent his young adulthood clawing for status as a surveyor and colonial militia officer instead. In the French and Indian War he had been humiliated at Fort Necessity, forced to sign a surrender document written in French that he couldn't read, one that unknowingly had him confessing to the assassination of a French officer. He had spent years afterward chasing a regular British Army commission and being politely, repeatedly, condescendingly denied one by officers who saw him as a provincial amateur. That specific grievance, being dismissed by British regulars as not a real soldier, never left him. 20 years later, command of the Continental Army gave him the one thing London had refused him: legitimacy. He was not going to lose it to the same kind of army that had once looked through him. What Washington decided in the last week of December 1776 was to stop fighting the war the British wanted him to fight. Trenton, New Jersey was garrisoned by roughly 1,500 Hessian troops, German auxiliaries hired by the British Crown, under Colonel Johann Rall, a battle-hardened, genuinely brave officer with one significant flaw. He considered the American army beneath serious concern, and he had ignored repeated warnings to fortify the town. Washington's plan was to cross the Delaware at night in a storm with two other columns crossing at separate points to support him, and hit Trenton at dawn from multiple directions before the enemy had any idea an American army was even functional anymore. Picture the scene at the crossing point, McConkey's Ferry, that Christmas night. The wind is coming hard enough that men are turning their backs to it between orders. General Henry Knox, a former Boston bookseller turned artillery officer, a genuinely enormous man at over 250 pounds, is bellowing instructions across the water in a voice that later became a private joke among the officers, since Washington reportedly said afterward that Knox's profanity alone was worth a regiment. The crossing, scheduled to be complete by midnight, is running desperately behind. Ice keeps fouling the boats. Colonel John Glover's Marblehead Regiment, fishermen and sailors from Massachusetts, men who actually know how to handle a boat in a current like this, are the ones keeping the operation from collapsing entirely. By 3 in the morning, the last boats are still crossing. Washington's revised schedule, which called for the attack to begin under cover of darkness, is already dead. He presses on anyway. Here's the detail that explains everything that follows, so it's worth sitting with for a second before we move on, because a lot of people underestimate what this campaign actually was, and if you want the full picture of exactly how it unfolds, subscribing means you won't miss the next parts of this channel's deep dives into the campaigns that actually turned the revolution. Now, back to the river. The two supporting columns, one under General James Ewing, meant to cross south of Trenton and block the enemy's retreat route, and one under Colonel John Cadwallader, meant to create a diversion further south near Bordentown. Both failed to cross at all. The ice was too thick, the current too violent, and both commanders turned back. Washington did not know this yet. He was advancing on Trenton with roughly 2,400 men, believing he had support on both flanks, and he had none. By 4 in the morning, Washington's force was finally moving on the two roads leading into Trenton, the River Road and the Pennington Road, splitting into two columns under his own command and that of General Nathaniel Greene, a former Rhode Island ironworker with a limp from a childhood injury and, by 1776, arguably Washington's sharpest tactical mind. The march covered roughly 9 miles from the crossing point in brutal cold, and at least 2 soldiers reportedly froze to death along the roadside before the fighting even began. Washington rode up and down the column, repeating one line to keep men moving. "Soldiers, keep by your officers." Muskets that had gotten wet were useless. When an aide told Washington the powder was too damp to fire, he reportedly answered that then they would use the bayonet, because Trenton had to be taken. Inside Trenton, Colonel Rahl spent Christmas night the way he'd spent most nights that winter, playing cards, drinking, dismissing the militia skirmishes of the past several days as nuisance raids from an army that, in his professional opinion, no longer had the stomach for real combat. A note had reportedly been handed to him earlier that evening warning of American troop movement across the river. Popular telling says he pocketed it unread and kept playing cards. The documentary record is murkier, but what's certain is he took no serious defensive precautions. No entrenchments. No forward pickets worth the name in the storm. 1,500 well-trained, well-equipped professional soldiers were about to be hit by a starving, half-frozen militia force they had every reason, on paper, to beat easily. At roughly 8 in the morning on December 26th, Washington's two columns hit Trenton almost simultaneously from the north. Greene's column down the Pennington Road, Washington's own along the River Road. Henry Knox's artillery, dragged across that same treacherous river the night before, was wheeled into position at the head of King and Queen Streets, the two main roads running through town, and began raking them with grapeshot the instant Hessian troops tried to form up in the open. This was the decisive tactical stroke of the entire battle. By controlling the two main streets with cannon, Washington denied Rahl's men the one thing trained European infantry relied on: the ability to form disciplined ranks and fire by volley. Every time Hessian companies tried to organize in the street, American guns tore through them. Rahl, roused from sleep, did manage to get dressed and mount a horse, and by most accounts fought with real personal courage, trying to rally his men into a counterattack toward an orchard on the edge of town. It didn't work. American infantry, converging from multiple directions, pinned the Hessians in a collapsing perimeter within the hour. Rahl was shot from his horse, hit twice, and carried into a nearby church, where he would die the following day. With their commander down and their formations shattered, the bulk of the Hessian garrison, over 900 men, laid down their arms. Chaos in the streets, cannon smoke hanging low over the rooftops, men surrendering in their nightshirts, 900 professional soldiers of the finest army money could hire, beaten in under 2 hours by an army that, 6 days earlier, barely existed. The numbers, stated plainly: roughly 22 Hessians killed, roughly 83 wounded, and 896 taken prisoner. American losses were 2 men frozen to death on the march and roughly 5 wounded. No combat deaths recorded in the battle itself. Washington had just destroyed an entire enemy garrison at almost no cost. The ripple effects moved fast and far. Word of Trenton reached Philadelphia and then London within weeks, and it detonated the prevailing British assumption that the American rebellion was a spent force requiring only mopping up. Enlistments, due to collapse entirely on December 31st, instead got extended. Washington personally rode along the ranks pleading with veterans to stay 6 more weeks for a bounty of $10, and enough of them did. On January 2, 1777, British General Lord Cornwallis marched a relief force of roughly 8,000 men to Trenton to crush Washington's army against the Delaware once and for all, and by nightfall believed he had them trapped, reportedly telling his officers he'd bag the old fox in the morning. Washington instead left his campfires burning, slipped his army out under cover of darkness on a little-known back road, and marched around Cornwallis's flank entirely. Hitting the British garrison at Princeton on January 3rd, where Continental forces, in a fight that included General Hugh Mercer being bayoneted to death after his horse was shot from under him, again routed a professional British force. 10 days, 2 battles, 2 humiliations. The military initiative in the Northern Theater, which the British had held since August, changed hands entirely. What happened to the people afterward tells its own story. George Washington used the momentum from these 10 days to hold the Continental Army together through the war's darkest winter, eventually leading it to final victory at Yorktown in 1781, where the surrendering British commander was, in one of the war's genuine ironies, Lord Cornwallis himself, the same general who had let Washington slip past him in the dark 5 years earlier. Colonel Johann Rall died of his wounds on December 27, 1776, one day after the battle, reportedly telling Washington, who visited him as he lay dying, that he had no regrets about how his men had fought, only about ignoring the warning note the night before. Henry Knox, the bookseller turned artillerist whose guns broke Trenton's streets, went on to become the United States' first Secretary of War. Nathaniel Greene, the limping ironworker, became one of Washington's most trusted generals and later led the campaign that broke British control of the American South. Owen Glover and his Marblehead fishermen, the men who physically got the army across the river, went on to ferry Washington's forces across other rivers throughout the war, quietly indispensable and rarely remembered. Lord Cornwallis spent the rest of his career trying to outrun the reputation Trenton and Princeton had put a crack in. A crack that widened at Yorktown until it swallowed the entire British war effort in America. The most feared professional army in the world was undone, in the end, not by matching it gun for gun, but by a general with nothing left to lose choosing the one move his enemy considered beneath serious consideration. Trenton today is a quiet state capital. The streets Knox's cannon once cleared are lined with parking meters and government buildings, and a single bronze marker on Warren Street notes, almost apologetically, where the fighting was thickest. If you want more campaigns like this one, the moments where a losing general found the one move nobody else saw coming, subscribe and hit the like button, and tell me in the comments. Which decision do you think mattered more to the outcome, Washington's choice to attack in the storm, or his choice to leave the campfires burning and slip past Cornwallis 5 nights later?